Friday night on the harbor road, the city glowed like a necklace of small suns, and I decided to be brave for once. Theo's laughter warmed the air between us, a low current I could lean into if I dared. I told him my ex was out of the picture, like tossing a stone into dark water and waiting for the ripples to smooth. We passed cafe windows that turned us into softer versions of ourselves. The air smelled of salt and rain and the bergamot I had dabbed on my wrist to feel untouchable. Theo didn't push. He just listened, a man who recorded sound for a living and knew silence could be a promise. Then my phone lit the inside of my palm like a match in a cave. Unknown number. I flipped it over. The screen reflected us both. Theo reached without thinking and said, "I've got it." When he answered, my past took a breath on the other end. "Mara," Evan said, "did you miss me?" The wind forgot how to move. I wanted to say this wasn't happening, that some prankster had found the one sentence I shouldn't have said out loud. But the city is a chorus of small truths, and mine chose that moment to sing. Theo didn't flinch when the voice used my name like an old key. He put the call on speaker and let the hush between heartbeats decide for us. "You said you were done," Evan said, like he was standing beside my chair. The rain outside agreed, tapping yes against the glass. I remembered the vial, the promise we made in a kitchen that was too narrow for change. I had whispered I wouldn't disappear. I had left anyway. "We don't owe you," Theo said, soft but steady. The lamp over our table glowed warmer, like courage had a color. When the line clicked dead, the screen went black and showed only our reflections, the woman trying to be braver than her fear, and the man who had decided to help. On the walk to the parking lot, the night pressed close, all ocean breath and neon nerves. Theo kept pace, half a step behind, a respectful orbit, as if I were a planet that might fall if handled wrong. I asked nothing. I told everything and nothing: how control can dress like devotion, how a promise can become a lock. When we reached my car, the mirror on the driver's side showed us with exquisite cruelty. Me alone. Theo's reflection wasn't there. The glass pooled, only my face, and something silver-eyed watching from behind my shoulder. "You're seeing that too," Theo said, not a question. I touched the mirror, and the cold slid into my skin like a coin under the tongue. Somewhere a tide turned. "I think," I said, "I broke a rule I didn't know had teeth." Back at my apartment, the air remembered the shapes we'd made months ago. Grief sharpened by clean counters and a lone mug. I set water to boil just to hear something human. Theo walked the perimeter like a sound engineer scouting HOs, palming the edges of mirrors, TV, phone screens. "He's using reflections," he said, and the truth of it slotted into place with a neat, merciless click. I opened the drawer where I'd buried the silver vial, its weight familiar as a bad habit. The label was smudged but legible for the truth between us. I should have thrown it away. I should have never kept it at all. But I uncapped it, and the room changed key. "If I speak it plain," I said, voice shaking, "will it let me go?" The kettle screamed, and the lights flickered, and something in the hallway mirror smiled with my ex's mouth. The phone rang again. Not a number. Just the word, unknown like a verdict. Theo's hand found the small of my back, a question without pressure. and I nodded because fear hates witnesses. I lifted the phone and didn't say hello. "You kept the vial," Evan murmured, as if he were already in the doorway, as if the hallway light belonged to him. "You kept me," I wanted to argue with a hurricane. "I kept a lesson," I said. "You kept a leash." The mirror on the wall went darker, pulling the room into its gravity. The voice on the line softened. The voice on the line softened. "Tell the truth, Mar. Tell him what you promised me." Theo's fingers curled at his sides. I thought of that kitchen. The steam, the vials, the soft yes that had felt like mercy. "I," Promi said. I said. Each word a key turning. "Never to leave you in the dark." The apartment held its breath, and something stepped out of the glass. A emerged halfway, a smear of winter-given shoulders, and the apartment turned into a held shore. Theo didn't run. He moved, like someone who knows thunder by its footsteps, sliding between me and the mirror with a calm that argued with gravity. "You don't get to use her promises like handcuffs," he said, and the air shivered as if words had barbs. Evan's voice rustled from the glass like silk over knives. "She vowed." He breathed. "And the court remembers." The hall lamp flickered in time with my pulse. I could still feel the kitchen we'd been, the softness I'd mistaken for safety. I raised the silver vial and uncapped it. The scent spilled out. Bergamot, orris, a cut of cold pear, and the mirror fog from the inside. Evan recoiled, not much, but enough to loosen the room's grip. "Truth is solvent," Theo murmured, as if he'd always believed that. For a moment, my fear remembered how to open its fists. We killed the lights and learned the room like a blindfold game. Screens went face down, mirror draped in a towel, phone asleep under a cushion. Theo spoke in a hush that belonged to late-night callers and confessions. "Sound travels different in empty spaces," he said, clipping a small recorder to his collar. "Maybe theirs does too." I wanted to laugh, to say there wasn't a frequency for regret, but a hiss crawled along the baseboards, a whisper of Evan's name for me wearing my breath. "They use surfaces," I said, tasting the truth I'd tried to perfume. "Any polished thing." The kettle ticked as it cooled. Theo tested the room with a snapped finger, listening to echoes tug back, like fish on invisible line. "Then we scuff the world," he said, gentle and fierce. A handed me a roll of painter's tape like a talisman. We marked the apartment in X's, little blue refusals that told the dark it could not have us whole. When dawn finally admitted a weaker kind of courage, I brewed tea that tasted like waking up from a too long sleep. Theo watched the window as if the day itself might be a trick. I asked, softly, what exactly I had promised. So I told him how Evan had read vows from a card he'd written himself, how I'd repeated the one line that made his shoulders lower, the one I thought would calm the seas. "Never leave you in the dark." A turned light into a leash, Theo said, and guilt scalded my throat more than the tea. Outside, a gull lifted into a pale sky, and the glass of the microwave flashed Evan's smile like a bad signal. I uncapped the vial again, drew a breath that tasted like citrus and rain. "Say it to me," Theo said, voice steady. "Say something true." It wasn't poetry. It was a plank in a flood. I said, "I'm scared." The glass went dull. The room exhaled. By noon, the apartment wore its X's like words. But the world beyond still glittered with traps. We took the back stairs, avoiding polished rails, stepping around puddles that looked like unblinking eyes. In the stairwell mirror we couldn't smother, the bailiff in glass waited with courtly patience, as if we'd arrived for an appointment we never set. Their voice rang inside the bones of the building, exact and polite. A promise was sworn, they said, without full consent. Remedy requires testimony. I felt the weight of being named, the way a case file might feel when it learns it has a spine. Theo's hand hovered near mine, not touching, a permission I could take. "What are the terms?" he asked, steady as a lighthouse. "Payne remembered," said the bailiff, offered freely. I thought of the kitchen again, of the soft yes that had barbed edges. "Then call the court," I said. "We'll speak." Sometimes courage is only choosing a hallway. We drew the curtains and turned the apartment into a ship readying for bad weather. I packed a bag with vials and blotters and the heavy perfume oils that felt like anchors. Theo packed microphones, gaffer's tape, a tiny speaker that could flood a room with pink noise. The phone lay face down like a sleeping coin, but we both kept glancing as if it might dream us into court without consent. "When we go," Theo said, "we don't go alone." He meant himself. He also meant the truth. I wrote my promise on a card, then wrote the one I wished I'd said: "I won't leave you in the dark again, because I will bring the light with me." The room steadied. Beyond the curtains, afternoon thinned toward the kind of evening that makes reflections sharper. "Ready?" he asked. I slid the card into my pocket, the vial into my palm, and nodded. Outside, somewhere, the glass cleared its throat. The bailiff's summons arrived not as a knock, but as a bright seam opening in the living room mirror, a careful mouth parting to speak law. We had an hour marked by the slow burn of a candle, its wax pooling like courage learning to hold shape. Theo stood close enough that his warmth felt like a promise I hadn't yet dared to ask for. Close enough that the apartment's old radiator sighed as if it remembered being young. "You don't have to go," he said, knowing I would. "You don't have to come," I answered, knowing he would. I told him about the kitchen vow, in all its smallness. My whisper meant to soothe a storm. His hunger for guarantees. The oath binding, the bailiff had said, was consent tilted by fear. Then we tilted back. Theo murmured. I wrote another truth on a card, not a leash, a light, and I slipped it into my pocket as the mirror brightened like dawn poured into silver. Crossing the mirror felt like walking into a held breath. Sound went velvet soft, color went cleaner, and the floor looked like water pretending to be glass. The liminal court stretched in terraces of reflection, each step a page from someone's old promise. We were not alone. Silhouettes moved beneath us like fish, memories schooling toward verdicts. The bailiff guided us with a nod that meant obedience and mercy in the same motion. Evan waited at the far end beneath a chandelier that caught no dust, only consequence. It looked exactly as I'd left him, which is to say he looked like an answer I'd learned to question. "You broke the dark," he said, voice gentled for the gallery. "You broke me." I wanted to argue with the weather of his hurt. Theo's fingers brushed my sleeve, a tether threaded through air. "Tell the court," he whispered, "what you meant. Truth gathered like rain before it falls. I promised not to leave you in the dark," I said, and the court made a sound like pages turning. I meant I would try to speak instead of vanish. I did not mean I would be your light on command. Evan's eyes softened, a trap disguised as tenderness. "You were afraid," he said, to the gallery as much as to me. "Fear is not consent," the bailiff replied, voice ringing like a ruler on a desk. Theo stepped forward, offering our little recorder as if it were a reliquary. "Truth has a frequency," he said. "Let the court hear it." He played the kitchen morning. My laugh that hoped to be brave, Evan's vow shaped like ownership, my echo shaped like apology. The sound hung above the water and split into harmonies, regret, longing, pressure. The chandelier dimmed. "Remedy requires pain remembered," said the bailiff. "Eke it whole." I inhaled the bergamot courage and opened the oldest door. I told the room what love had felt like when it turned narrow dinners scheduled to the minute. Friends reordered like drawers. Tenderness that required proof on command. I told them about the small kindnesses that kept me almost convinced. The court listened with terrible patience. I said the word control, and the chandelier shed one cold tear of light. Evan flinched. "I wanted certainty," he said, voice frayed. "You wanted ownership," I answered, and my voice did not break. Theo's presence steadied me like a hand on a rudder. The bailiff asked, "What did you keep for yourself?" "The vial," I admitted. "The last thing that smelled like hope." The bailiff inclined their head. "Fen mix a truth now," they said. "Name what your vow could have been." My fingers remembered recipes. Oris for memory, pear for the first morning, bergamot for bravery. I added salt from my tongue and called it mine. I lifted the blotter and spoke the vow into it, each word a thread through cloth. "I will not leave you in the dark, because I will carry my own light, and I will choose where it shines." The scent opened, bright, green, courageous, then settled into Oris, an honest H. The court brightened. Evan swayed as if a tide had changed direction. He reached, palms pleading. "Mara!" His voice was the house we built and the door I locked. "Let me go," I said, and it surprised me that I meant it for both of us. The bailiff's mouth curved, almost kind. "Consent restored," they pronounced. Binding weakened. For dissolution, a witness must offer risk. Theo stepped into the light without looking away from me. "You'll stake it," he said, simple as rain. My heart struck a bell. I hadn't known I was carrying. The mirror behind the dice opened like a sky. The court released us like swimmers breaking surface. Lungs burning, with a truth too new to trust. On the threshold, Evan lingered, his voice turned low and human, like memory trying to bargain. "A doesn't know what you do when you're scared," he said, and the sentence was a blade wrapped in velvet. I looked at Theo, who stood steady as a lighthouse built by stubborn hands, and felt the small quake where fear lives under the ribs. The bailiff inclined their head, consent restored, not safety promised. A mirror sealed with a clean, merciless hush. Outside, late evening sharpened every pane of glass into a listening ear. We walked home the long way, avoiding shop windows and puddles that jittered with our reflections. "I won't chase your ghosts," Theo said, gentle, which is to say brave. I believed him. I also found the old key in my pocket, the one that opens doubt, and turned it twice, just to hear it click. Morning came with the grainy light of a truth hangover. Theo brewed coffee in my kitchen as if he'd always known where the mugs lived, radio key humming, stitched between us. My phone pulsed with a voicemail from his station, an anonymous caller whose voice knew his name too well. It shouldn't have mattered, but jealousy is an echo that wears your heartbeat. "Shay calls a lot," he said, frank, no wince, which somehow made the bruise sharper. I smiled like a professional, and my hands forgot the choreography of. In the microwave door, Evan's mouth formed a word I refused to learn. "You don't have to prove anything," Theo said, but proof was a language I had been forced to speak for a year too long. I nodded and swallowed something I should have told him. Outside, the day brightened, and every brightness felt like a test I could fail by blinking. Theo's studio smelled like cedar and late nights. Coils of cables leapt like tame snakes, and a wall of foam swallowed sound so completely that even breath felt edited. A played the caller's message to show me there was nothing inside it but static need and admiration. The words were harmless. My fear was not. "I don't need certainty," he said, hands open. "I need you." It should have landed like rescue. Instead, Evan's old lesson rose from muscle memory. Certainty means safety, and safety means obedience. I don't want to be another project. I snapped and heard how unfair it sounded the second it left its jaw. Silence swelled, thick and real. Theo looked at the floor, as if the grain could teach him how not to wince. "I'm not trying to fix you," he said, soft. "I'm trying to stand with you." The room held its breath. A dark monitor flickered, catching 3 versions of me who didn't agree. I left before the apology could decide which one of us it wanted, walking until the city's glitter scraped thin. The old apartment, ours, once, sat above, a florist that still overwatered the begonias. My key wouldn't fit, which should have been comfort, but in the brass door glass, Evan waited like a wish I was ashamed of. "You could have certainty here," he said, and the word sounded less like a cage than it should have. "You could rest." He spoke as if he had built rest himself, brick by patient brick. I thought of the vow I'd spoken in the court, the light I promised to carry, and still my hand lifted because ghosts are heavy and nostalgia is a liar. "You left me in the dark," he said, letting the accusation warm his palms. "Come inside and we'll turn everything on." I stood on the step where I had once chosen to live, and felt the whole city lean. Theo found me by the scent I'd mixed in the court, the one that carried my light like a lantern cupped in two hands. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood below the stoop and let love make him taller. "You don't owe him certainty," he said. "You owe yourself daylight." Evan's reflection sharpened, anger finding its edge. The glass between us thickened like water starting to freeze. "She vowed," he said, as if the word were a net. "And I unvowed," I answered, surprised my voice had steel in it. The door glass erupted in a spiderweb of cracks that didn't fall. A threat held in suspension. "Risk?" The bailiff's voice murmured from no visible surface, as if the law traveled on breath. Theo stepped onto the stoop and took my free hand. "Take it with me," he said, staking himself on the sentence. The cracks whitened. The reflection bled to static, and the night took one cautious step back. We did not speak for a long time after the glass stopped trembling. The city thinned to a hush that tasted like rainwater and regret. I sank to the floor with my back against the door, feeling the grooves where old choices had worn the wood, and told Theo the smallest, truest thing I could hold without breaking it. I had learned to keep the peace the way people learn to hold their breath underwater. I had made myself quiet to survive the echo of another person's certainty. I knelt, close, but not touching, and admitted he feared becoming a place I hid rather than a life I chose. The words fell between us like stones and made a foundation. When the bailiff's voice drifted from the dark television, formal as midnight law, it did not startle us. "Remedy requires risk," they reminded. Theo looked at me as if we stood on a shore and the tide was asking for our names. He said he would wager his voice. I said I would wager my memory of sweetness. I set vials on the coffee table like small altars and blended the scent of my cowardice and my bravery in equal parts. Oris, for the promises I had meant and the silences I had worn like jewel. Bir, for the morning I had believed in beginnings. Bergamot, for the courage I could borrow if I breathed deeply and did not look away. Theo placed a recorder beside them, not to capture proof, but to witness. The bailiff's terms slid through the room. Each of us must reopen the wound we most pretend has healed, and we must do it with the other watching. I expected Theo to flinch. He stood his ground. A unspooled a story about a father who loved applause and left home when the clapping stopped, and how a boy learned to make rooms adore him so the emptiness would not land. I told a story about a girl who called surrender kindness and could not tell the difference in the dark. Memory of a yet the vial-like tide obeys a moon. The living room dissolved, and I stood again in the narrow kitchen that had once been a promise. The power had gone out that night, and the dark was so complete, it felt almost kind, like a curtain that could hide an exit. Evan's breathing had measured the room. He had asked for certainty in a voice that sounded like sleep and hunger in equal parts. I had written a note as if paper could carry a soul across a river. I had kept my shoes in my hands to make less noise and stepped down the hall, without looking back because I knew if I looked, I would stay. In the present, I spoke every detail to Theo, every softness that had been a trap, every tenderness I had used as an excuse to delay leaving. And I did not apologize for choosing myself. The bailiff said good. The word felt like a bandage warming to skin. Theo's turn came, like weather changing in the bones. A quid a track on his small speaker, a low field of pink noise that softened the edges of the room and spoke into it the night his father left. How sound can make a door's click last for years. His voice wavered once, the way a violin string will when the bow is too honest. I wanted to reach for his hand, and I did not, because witness is not rescue. Avon's face surfaced in the black mirror of the television, listening like a thief choosing a window. He offered the obvious bargain, sweetness sharpened to a point. Give me the vow again. Let me keep the light, and we all stop hurting. Theo's eyes found mine. He said he would rather be silent forever than watch me love a cage. The bailiff let the sentence stand in the air like a drawn blade. Consent recorded, they said, and the room rang. Just before dawn, the city's windows turned pale as fish bellies, and the mirror on our wall went silver as a wound thinking about healing. The bailiff announced convening, not with thunder, but with the quiet certainty of a schedule that cannot be argued. We packed what mattered and left the rest. Truth travels light when it decides to. On the street, the air tasted like tin and new beginning. Avon waited in the florist's glass. Not a man now, but a promise with legs, and he watched us with the steady patience of someone who believes time is his accomplice. Decide, he said, and for once the word did not scare me. I took Theo's hand. In front of the whole blinking morning, and said the vow I had mixed the night before, letting my voice land in the space between us and stay there. The mirror brightened to white. The liminal court opened its mouth. We stepped inside together. The court received us like a cathedral that had studied oceans. Sound moved with the slow authority of tides, and every step returned to us twice, once as footfall, once as memory. The bailiff named the matter, each syllable a rung on a ladder none of us wanted to descend. Evan stood across the mirror water and wore grief like a fitted suit. I could have mistaken it for love if I hadn't learned the difference in a language that cost me sleep. Theo's hand brushed mine, an anchor offered without chain. The bailiff asked for opening testimony. Avon spoke first, voice burnished for the gallery, telling a story where I was a flicker that kept leaving him dark. I watched the chandelier tremble, not with drama, but with comprehension. When it was my turn, I told the court I had left because light is not a promise you can warehouse. Behind me, Theo breathed in time with my courage, and the hall tilted toward a decision not yet born. The bailiff called for artifacts of the vow. Evan produced the note ID left, a paper bird folded around a frightened heart. I read the line where I apologized for going while he slept, and the court seemed to lean toward him, human as a jury that could be charmed. I unstoppered my violin memory, unrolled like a film that had waited years for a projector. I described the kitchen, the outages, the certainty purchased by small surrenders. Theo asked leave to demonstrate. Permission granted. E struck a tone from a tuning fork and held it near the water floor. The pitch shivered our reflections into three selves. What we meant, what we said, what was heard. In mine, the apology ringed like a flare begging for rescue. In Evan's, it wore a leash. The bailiff inclined their head as if the air had presented evidence. Perception diverges, they said. Remedy requiris aligment. I felt the court rotate infinitesimally toward daylight. Cross-examination arrived like winter, not unkind, simply thorough. Evan asked whether I had ever promised to stay. I said no, I had promised to speak before leaving. I said yes, and watched the court replay a dozen soft warnings I'd offered, each one landing on him like a feather no storm could start with. Theo's turn was quick and clean. He let silence do the asking until Evan filled it with the admission that certainty mattered more to him than consent. The chandelier dimmed, the way day will when it chooses to be honest. The bailiff requested a demonstration of risk. Theo set his recorder on the water and offered his voice as collateral. A life lived without the work that steadied him if the dissolution failed. I offered my memory of sweetness with Evan, every soft goodnight and warm shoulder, to be burned if needed. The court's breath drew in, and the water mirrored a fire it did not contain. Verdict would not be thunder. It would be grammar. The bailiff instructed us to speak the vow as it should have been, then speak the unbinding that must follow. My throat shook. Habit knows how to survive by being pleasing. Theo's voice steadied me, a shoreline you can aim for when muscles fail. Not a leash, I began. Pulse a drum I refuse to mute. A light I carry, shared when I choose. Evan's face folded, something breaking that I could pity without inviting back. The bailiff nodded. Consent aligned. For dissolution, they said, one of us must release the other without condition. I looked at Evan and waited for anger to sharpen me. Instead, an old tenderness rose like weather that no longer ruled me. I release you, I said, to find light that isn't mine. The court brightened in a hush that felt like doors unlocking. Evan closed his eyes, and for the first time did not reach. Umbinding asked its price. Like any good ritual, plainly. The bailiff named the cost. Theo's voice would go quiet for a day and a night. Mine would lose the taste of a certain sweetness for as long as it took to stop aching. We accepted. The court inhaled and the mirror water rose in a sheet that didn't wet us, passing through like a transparent bell. Sound died to a silver hush. I reached for Theo's hand and felt language still living in the pulse of his fingers. Evan stepped back into his reflection, and for once looked smaller than the life he'd tried to build around me. Oh, I told him, and it wasn't cruel. It was accurate. The bailiff closed their ledger. Binding dissolved, they said, and the hall exhaled morning. The seam home opened, bright as a relief you can walk through. Theo touched his throat, smiling without sound. I pressed my card to my heart and found it beating under its own light. Home was not the same room. It was a frequency that had learned our names. Morning arrived like a soft verdict, cupboards whispering open, kettle singing the smallest brave song. Theo's voice was gone by choice and law, but his silence didn't feel empty. It felt like a hand cupped around a candle. He wrote on a note card, funny and simple, I'm okay. A drew a lighthouse with a crooked beam. I laughed. And then I cried because absence had never been kind before, and now it was gentle. I brewed tea I could not sweeten, and the H where earlier sweetness had lived glowed like a bruise that meant blood was moving again. We moved carefully, clinking porcelain like bells to mark the hours. When the phone buzzed with no name attached, it didn't feel like a hook. It felt like weather beyond a window. I pressed delete. Theo kissed my wrist where the perfume had dried and smiled the word I heard without hearing here. By afternoon, we tested the city like swimmers testing new water. Reflections behaved themselves, offering only what the light offered, no more. Shop windows showed us two people who had slept very little and looked better for it. The kind of beauty that comes from not bracing anymore. In the florist, I asked for stems that smelled like quiet victories. Freesia, a feistful of green, and paid with hands that didn't shake. We walked the pier and let the wind argue with our hair. Theo wrote, "When I can speak, I'll ruin you with niceness." I wrote back, "I will permit it." We carried our silence like a bouquet between us, held together with twine. At a public restroom, mirror checked for silver eyes, and found only my own, red-rimmed, alive. "You kept the light," I told my reflection softly, and it didn't echo with anyone else's mouth. Oh. A gull laughed over the water. It sounded like permission. Evening thinned the gold from the day and left us with a soft blue that made lamp switches feel ceremonial. We lit one and then another, not to banish anything, but to bless it. The bailiff appeared in the black of the TV, like a reflection you invite, not a trespass. Their voice returned, cool as a judge, robe folded right. "The binding holds no more," they said. "The witness may reclaim his voice at first light." Theo bowed, a courtly joke, hand over heart. I mirrored him because joy unbinds dignity. "And the sweetness?" I asked. "It will stay lost," they said, "until you forgive the version of you who needed it to survive." That felt like a map, not a sentence. After they faded, we sat on the carpet and traded stories by pen. My grandmother's kitchen in summer. His first radio shift alone at 2 a.m. We told enough truth to fill the room with air. Breathing was easy. Night deepened into the hour when future choices rehearsed themselves. We stood on the rooftop under a city sky that pretended to be starless and found 3 brave ones anyway. Theo's voice still belonged to silence, but his hands spoke a question traced in the air, a promise pressed into my palm by touch alone. I understood the way you understand music without knowing the notes. I told him what I wanted in words shaped for forever and daily bread at once. I wanted mornings with ordinary weather and no tests in the light. I wanted a life where love didn't require winning, only choosing. He answered by taking out a coil of gaffer's tape and tearing it in two. We laughed into our hands like thieves of our own fear. I said at vow, "That wasn't a leash. I will bring my light and keep enough for myself and share it because I want to, not because I must." The city listened kindly. Owen returned Theo's voice, and it arrived in my kitchen the way sunlight does. Soft at first, then undeniable. He tested it on the small things. "Good morning. More tea? Come here." I tested forgiveness by making toast without the old H. It wasn't sweet. It was clean. We walked to the harbor and opened the shop early. I set my new blend on the counter and wrote the label with a hand that didn't shake daylight. Oris, Pear, Bergamot, and choice. Customers would ask what choice smelled like, and I would tell them it smells like staying on purpose. When the door chinged, the bell didn't sound like a verdict, only a bell. We were not perfect. We were possible. I slipped my card into the register. I will not leave you in the dark, because I carry my own light, and I choose to share it with you. Theo read it aloud, the first true spell of the morning, and the city answered with sun.